This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to the In Focus podcast. I am Kalyan, your host for this episode. A few weeks ago, Donald Trump told black journalists at Chicago in the US that Kamala Harris had identified herself more as Indian and not black.
She was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black.
He was trying to tell black journalists, as well as black voters, that Kamala Harris was not black enough. While that criticism has been made against Kamala, as well as Obama for that matter, it also threw into focus Indian Americans who form a small part of the overall population in America, but who are not quite visible in American politics, government, business, and academia today. We have Vijay Prashad, academic, author, and activist, who's executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and author of the seminal book Karma of Brown Folk about Indian Americans. This was written some 25 years ago. And so he's here to discuss with us the continuing journey of Indian Americans in the context of Kamala Harris, her candidacy, her rise to political superstardom, I suppose. And also specifically Black-Indian relations. She's half Black, she's half Indian. And Vijay does talk about it in some depth in his book. So welcome, Vijay.
Hey, it's great to be with you. Back home in the Hindu, yeah.
Vijay does have a long association with the Hindu. He's written for the Hindu forefront line. So your Karma of Brown Folk, it was written at a time when Desis, you use the word Desis in the book quite liberally in the book. They were just about being recognized as a community. When I know you would contest this word term that they were making a mark in American life. You would say, whose mark? Who made those markers? You would say the white markers, but they were barely a community. Now they seem to be all over. They are very visible in the media, very visible in politics too, in high positions. How would you write the Karma of Brown Folk 2.0, if you would?
Well, firstly, it's a throwback to think about that book, as you say, written a quarter century ago, very long time ago, a different moment, different sensibility, a different kind of political climate. The basic point about that book was what I thought of as this twice born community, using that term quite deliberately, twice born. This community was extremely fortunate. You know, these were people, by and large, who migrated to the United States after the Immigration Act was altered in 1965. From 1924 to 1965, Asians were barred from entering the United States. It was a racist law put in place in the 1920s. But in 65, the migrants who entered the United States entered through very specific categories. They entered as highly sophisticated, highly trained professionals. That's the only way to have really to have come in with a science degree, mathematics degree, to have brought those skills to bear into this society that was terrified. It was losing the space race against the Soviet Union. That's really why the 1965 Act was passed, to allow Asians in. Now, why is this community twice born? In the first instance, most of the people who were born, who came into the United States after 1965, were either born right after 1947 or just before 1947. In other words, this was a community of people who didn't directly participate in the independence struggle for India. It was granted to them by their parents, their grandparents, and so on. So they entered an India as children, and benefited from massive state support in their education. They were given, highly sophisticated education in science and so on through the newly formed Indian Institute of Technology and various other colleges. Indian government spent a lot of precious money on the training of people in these fields. So they, in a sense, were blessed. They didn't have to struggle for the benefits that they got basically for free. And then they go to the United States after 1965, and here comes the second twice born. Because in the United States, from 1945 to 1965 was a fierce period of the civil rights struggle when people fought for the kind of basic civil liberties that should be afforded in any society. No racism, no apartheid as such. The Jim Crow policy of blacks go to that bathroom, whites go to this bathroom, and Indians would fall in between, and in many cases had to go into the bathroom for blacks, for instance. They tried to masquerade as whites, found it hard in many cases. Um, so in the second, twice born, they arrived in the United States after the Civil Rights Act had been passed, after the voting rights had been passed. This is a twice blessed community. They didn't have to fight for Indian independence, they got its benefit. They didn't have to fight for the civil rights movement, they got that benefit. And then they arrived with these enormous advantages of degrees. And they didn't see themselves as being sort of state selected. They were selected by the state, by the United States. This is not natural selection. Indians are not blessed in science. Okay, I mean, whatever people in Tamil Nadu might believe about mathematical skills and so on, lots of people in even Tamil Nadu or in other states don't know how to do mathematics. Okay, our literacy rate at independence was about 13%. So it's not that Indians are blessed with some sort of, scientific and mathematical intelligence. It's that the United States deliberately selected certain people with certain skills to come to the United States. And they then, of course, flourished because they were beneficiaries of two major historical processes for which they didn't sacrifice personally. And they came as a community with enormous skills. You can imagine people would gather on the weekend. There'd be like, young children growing up in those households. There'd be a scientist, a mathematician, highly skilled people. And so the culture of work, skill, self-confidence grew in those communities, and the community set itself apart from other minorities, began to see itself as a so-called model minority, as a minority that could model for others, when in fact its social history was so very different. And so that book, Karma of Brown Folk, was written in a sense to be a kind of clarion call, a scream into the dark, saying, look, we are not special. We are actually shaped by this destiny. There are histories that we need to acknowledge. And the title of the book, sort of winks at a very famous book published in 1903 by W.E.B. Du Bois, the great black Marxist sociologist in the United States. The book was called The Souls of Black Folk, where Du Bois was trying to suggest that the black experience in the United States wasn't merely an experience of sorrow, but it was an experience of struggle. It was an experience of contradiction, that black people, as marginalized and exploited people, saw the world through their eyes and through the eyes of the whites, and that created a kind of contradiction. So I wanted to draw from that great legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois and call this book The Karma of Brown Folk. The karma, of course, being this twice blessed character of having skipped two major social processes and then benefited through state selection. So that's really what I wrote about 25 years ago.
If you were to write the second edition or Karma Brown Folk 2.0, how would you write it? What has been the Indian American journey since then? I mean, in the context of Kamala Harris or even Vivek Ramaswamy or even Nikki Haley, these political superstars in business and so on. Where do you think Indian Americans as a whole, how far they have traveled? What have they done?
Well, I was trying to duck your question. I was deliberately being evasive because I'm not really sure what I would do, honestly. But here's a try. Actually, a few years ago, I did write a second book called Uncle Swami, which was about the rise of a kind of Hindu sensibility amongst the Indian American community, going back to ideas such as, how in the 1990s a great deal of money for the Ram Temple building was raised in the United States. People from the various Hindu right organizations would travel across the US, have house parties and would raise cash money and then take it back to India. It went through various foundations. I tracked some of that stuff. I also wrote about the relationship between Indian Americans and the growing institutional relationship with Jewish Americans, a kind of new kind of right wing, a minority right wing that seemed to be developing at the time. That book, now also about 10, 12 years old, things have changed a lot. And I suppose what I would focus on now, if I was to do a kind of new understanding of this, is I would focus actually on the silenced peoples in the community. Over the years, very large number of working class, lower middle class Indian Americans have come to the United States. Once you open provisions like family reunification, you can't then say, oh, wait, you have to have a mathematics PhD. I'm the mathematics PhD, and I bring my cousin or I bring my sister. These people need not have the same educational qualifications as I do, and they end up then working as bank tellers or they run kiosks or whatever. So, in fact, there's a very large silent population of Indian Americans that exists. Many of them live in poverty. People who work in the small motels, these family owned motels. Family labor, as you well know, is a highly exploitative enterprise, because you don't feel the need to even register people as workers, people who are making beds in remote motels owned by a Gujarati family. Or if we go beyond India, Bangladeshi American families that run kiosks where they sell magazines and so on. Taxi drivers, enormous number of Indian taxi drivers in places like New York City, and then out of the United States in Toronto and San Francisco and so on. There's a silent and invisible section of the Indian American population that doesn't get talked about. And from them have emerged trade union leaders and others who represent their voices. And again, we don't hear from them. What we do see, in a sense, are the children of that earlier generation of migration. People like Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley. People like that were beneficiaries of exactly what I described. They don't have any kind of understanding of the broader needs of society. They were raised in the United States. Their sort of model minority arrogance lifted them into US conservatism. Pull yourself up with your bootstraps. Why do you need government assistance? We didn't get government assistance. Some of them even sort of walk away from their Indian heritage. I mean, Nikki Haley, for instance, is Namrita Randhawa. She never uses her name. She's Nikki Haley. She doesn't talk at all about being from a South Asian Punjabi background. Vivek Ramaswamy, well, he's stuck with the name Vivek Ramaswamy, but there's very little about uh, his own background, although he's interesting because he took religious conservatism and said, I'm proud to be a practicing Hindu. I have no problem. I don't need to be a Christian. The point is to be have family values and be a conservative and be a religious conservative. So he did something interesting that earlier Indian American conservatives didn't do. Dinesh D'Souza, for instance, didn't play up his heritage at all. He in fact denied it. He was an early conservative in the Indian American community. Mr. D'Souza's direct heir is somebody like Nikki Haley, very much a right wing person. Although against Trump, she tried to position herself as a moderate. There's nothing moderate about her record. But as you can see, there's very little about Indian or the Indian experience that they talk about. That's not essential. The only thing is when they say, well, we did it on our own. Why do you need social support? Why do you need welfare support and so on? They mobilize this false story of Indian American success to use as a hammer against anybody else that should actually, by right, get certain kinds of benefits and so on. I mean, descendants of enslavement deserve rights of various kinds. And I should say, Kalyan, because I think this is important, that a number of people who did migrate into the United States came from dominant caste backgrounds, and they also were sort of fleeing, in one way or the other, what they saw as the reservations policy in India. And so they intuitively dislike the affirmative discrimination policies that would help African Americans and so on. I forgot to mention that, but that's a key part of the consciousness. This sort of intuitive, instinctive dislike of the idea that the state should come in and help people. I mean, this comes from people who were helped by the state multiple ways, but that history is occluded, that history is set aside, that history is put into the shadows, and instead you get this idea that we did it on our own, and hence that we did it on our own story leads them directly into the Republican Party, into conservatism. In that respect, there is that sort of unspoken section, because the majority of Indian Americans, when polled, actually poll as Democrats, not as Republicans. So these instances of people who claim this sort of conservative mantle, they are standing in for a community that doesn't stand behind them. That's what's very interesting. Kamala Harris is a unique phenomena because she's not exactly here or there, and I know we're going to get into that.
Right. At some point, it seemed as if the second generation, including of people who were born to, privileged parents or people from upper caste backgrounds, they didn't seem infected by it. Do you think that's changed? Are they more quote unquote Hindu, more right wing now, more tending towards Republican politics?
Well, what kills the Indian American affiliation to republicanism is the anti-immigrant sentiment. It's very hard to square that, because Indian families, by and large, are quite large families, and there's a tendency always to act like the beachhead. The first person arrives, and then they sort of look backwards to home and say, "I'm building a bridge. Don't worry. I'll bring this relative who can't find a job. I'll bring that relative." This beachhead attitude of Indian migrants is very much prevalent, not only in the United States but in other countries. People generally don't want to migrate just by themselves. They want to bring their parents, their siblings, their this, their that. Also distant relatives who can't get employment or who need help. I mean, in that sense, one of the principal welfare associations in India is the family. And so this sort of rubs against the whole attitude of the Republican Party. So the Republicans have a problem attracting a lot of Asian communities, principally on the issue of the anti immigrant sentiment. Similar with Latinos, although there's one difference. Latinos have been in the United States for much longer. So the connection to quote unquote family in the homeland is not always so strong. It's you've been away for 200 years. You're not thinking about my family in Guadalajara or whatever. But Indian family just migrated, say, 30 years ago. There's still the thought, my mother is getting old, I want to bring her. Well, the Republicans say, I'm sorry, you can't bring her. She'll be a drag on the system. So it's hard for Republicans to appeal to these younger migrant communities. It's very difficult. The second, third generation people that grew up, I mean, it's a split situation, because this whole ethos of growing up in the United States as a minority creates its own identity. It creates its own issue. And what I found 25 years ago, and I think is still very much in play, is that when these migrants that were affluent, the affluent section, moved to suburbs, raised their children among mainly white communities, then these children get to college and they rediscover that they are Indian. They want to learn the Indian languages. They come to spend a summer with their relatives in India and so on. Some of them even want to move and live in India for a while. They feel comfortable. They didn't like be feeling disrespected by their white colleagues as kids. That phenomena continues and will continue for one or two more generations, until people become older migrants, where, older in terms of the history of their migration, where they get more settled and there's larger community and there's more role models for them to develop their own sense of who they are and so on. But, the, let's say, Indian American left wing, or even the Indian American community, there are enormous numbers of Indian Americans, for instance, in the Democratic Socialists of America, young kids who join the DSA and so on. I see them all the time. But as I say, these are part of that invisible section. The Indian taxi driver or the Indian left winger, the tenant rights organizer. We don't get much press and publicity for them. I mean, imagine the newspapers in India. Newspapers in India are just convulsed on the histories of those migrants who sort of make it. The rich, the ones who had some scientific breakthrough. When do you ever see a profile on, like a tenant rights organizer or a taxi driver union leader, leader of a trade union in Schenectady, New York, who's Indian American? We never hear about them as stories. They are invisibilized, and I think that produces its own snowball. The more you have stories about so-called success, I designed something, I did so well in this field. The more you start believing that that's actually the totality of a community. I mean, that this actually is not just for Indian Americans. This is part of one of the, I think, what I consider to be a drawback of the current media is it doesn't actually cover the totality of the human experience. It tends to cover narrow success. Sainath, who used to also be with the Hindu, used to say always that there were more journalists covering the Mumbai Fashion Week than covering the agrarian crisis in India. And that tells you a little bit also about how perceptions are shaped. And perceptions shape human behavior. We live by how we assume things are, not always by realities.
Yeah. Coming back to Kamala Harris, she is, as you described, her mother at least comes from this socially privileged background. She's not unlike her mother, especially, is not unlike many of the Indian immigrants whom you described. But her mother seems to have chosen a different path, and that seems to have led Kamala Harris to where she is now. How do you see this? And it's also an interesting. She brings to mind a very interesting equation: the equation between or race relations between Indians and blacks here in the US, I mean, in Africa, in the Caribbean. How do you see her?
First, it's interesting to talk a little bit about Kamala Harris's mother, Shamla Gopalan. I think this is an interesting story. She is slightly older than many of the migrants that went into the US after 1965. She was born about 10 years before independence. But still, imagine that. You're a 10-year-old when India is independent. You don't have a full memory of the independence struggle. Her father was a civil servant. Wasn't somebody who necessarily participated on the streets of the civil servant. I mean, he was the opposite. He became he was a member of the imperial secretariat and so on. But then she had her own history is interesting. She became a biologist, a science person. Went to UC Berkeley. She worked in UC Berkeley her entire career. And while at UC Berkeley, she did something which is unusual. I mean, she met an African American man. Well, in fact, he was Jamaican. He was not African American. He was Jamaican, Donald Harris. They met, they fell in love, they got married, and then they had two children. But within I think less than 10 years they divorced, and he basically had minimal contact with his family, um, for the rest of their lives. Although Shamla Gopalan made sure to take her children to Jamaica to see her parents, father's family, and so on. Now, Donald Harris is interesting because he was a development economist. He was very much like Barack Obama's father, somebody who came to the United States to study development economics in order to go home and develop their countries. Um, Harris was a sort of left Keynesian, maybe a soft Marxist. Um, you know, Obama's father went back to Kenya, but Donald Harris didn't. He also had a academic career. Pretty, very sophisticated, important scholar. He taught at Stanford University, but again, he didn't have a complete connect with Kamala Harris. She was raised by her mother. Mother was a single mother. Raised two daughters. Very difficult to do something like that with the kind of professional job that she had. It's a credit to her. Um, so that's her history. She has an Indian mother, she has a Jamaican father. Donald Trump can't take that away from her. That's a reality. Sorry, Donald, I don't think she was hiding any part of her history. This is who she is. But of course, she's a professional politician, and as a professional politician, wrote her own story. Professional politicians are not going to allow you to write their story for them. She wrote her own story, and it's an impressive story. She rose very quickly, became uh, you know a rising figure in California's political life, attorney general, state attorney general. Went on to do all kinds of things in the US Senate for a brief period that she was there, picked as Biden's vice president. Now, let's go back to this issue of who Kamala Harris is. I mean, Kamala Harris is a classic product of California. It's not an unusual thing in a place like Berkeley, for an Indian woman to meet a Jamaican man, and they fall in love, and they are both professionals, both smart people, both academics of a kind. What did they meet as? Did they meet as an Indian and a Jamaican, or did they meet as two intellectuals who got to know each other and so on? I mean, I want to put this directly because this also comes to a kind of bizarre way in which people think of identity and children and love and so on. When you meet somebody that you fall in love with, what are you meeting them as? I mean, are you meeting them as a Tamilian or as a Gujarati? I mean, there's something ridiculous about this conversation about, oh well, her father is like he's Jamaican and her mother is Indian. Well, they met as Donald and Shamla. That's who they met as, and then they had two children. I mean, Kamala Harris was raised with a Jamaican father to some extent, but largely with an Indian mother. That's her history, right?
So when Donald Trump, when he was speaking to the National Association of Black Journalists, he circulated this photo of Kamala Harris with her Indian side of the family, and he said she's Indian, and now she's suddenly turned black. But again, that brings into focus this question. You have a whole chapter in your book, Karma of Brown Folk, on anti-black racism on the part of Indians. How has that panned out over the years?
Yeah, I just want to insist first that we're also talking about the child of two people, and these two people fell in love and they had a child, so it's important that we recognize that she doesn't stand in for Indian and he doesn't stand in for black. They are also two people. And the reason I say that is because, my God, there's such a deep antipathy in our world to people from different backgrounds meeting and having children and so on. I mean, look at the languages that exist. The word mulatto is the word that comes to mind, a grotesque word from the times of deep racism. it refers to the product or child of somebody who's white and somebody who's black, and they don't produce a healthy child. They produce a mulatto, in other words a mule. And mules, as you know, cannot reproduce. And that's where that term comes from. An ugly way to talk about people who cross, let's say, strict lines of division, social division between people. So I just want to say that, Kalyan, because I don't want to take Kamala Harris and the example of Donald Harris and Shamla Gopalan and say, well, let's use them as a kind of metaphoric way of talking about Indian black relations, because these are also two people. She was also their child. And whatever I think about her politics, I'm pretty tender about people who go through that experience. I have children in the similar position, and I always tell them, you're not half this, half that. You're two, you're double, you're this and that. You're two. You're two of you is inside you, not half something. You can't be half an Indian and half a Jamaican. That's not possible. You can only be Jamaican and Indian. You what is half anything? It's ridiculous. You're all of these experiences. Anyway, having said that, that coming also from a personal place, if you get my meaning, um, coming from a more, let's say, quote unquote, scientific way of looking at this, social scientific way of looking at the question of Black Indian relations in general as they've evolved in the United States over time. It's hard to say in a general way. And some of this is principally because there is a social segregation that has remained intact. In the United States, there's a tendency, and I would say this is there in many societies, not just in the United States. There's a tendency for people to bunch into neighborhoods or bunch into social circles. With the new immigrants from Asia, from parts of Africa, and so on, some of this has to do with language and comfort. I mean, you have lived in the United States, so you know how peculiar this is. That you'll have, let's say, a Carnatic music association, and people meet once a month to discuss Carnatic music. You'll have some narrow caste association, not just say Tamil Brahmin association, but some narrow Gotra meets, on certain days. They have their own celebrations. There's also, like, probably, and I know there is, not probably, there's a Tamil language association where people meet and talk. They recite poetry and they want their children to come into their language community and so on. There's a way in which people's social lives have remained segregated. And this, I feel, looking back at other histories, might go for one or two, maybe one more generation, and then it begins to close down. As children and grandchildren no longer live in your language community, as they begin to form different forms of community, where they interact more with people from other backgrounds and create different geographical communities and so on. You get these ethnic things becoming sort of more and more distant in the rearview mirror as you drive forward into a country. It's interesting why I'm saying this. Was politically interesting. In the 1950s, early 1950s, Nehru traveled to South Africa, to East Africa. He traveled to East Africa. And I think, I'm not sure exactly whether it was in Uganda or Kenya, but Nehru gave a speech at one of these countries, where he said to the Indian community there, look, you're Indian and you'll always be Indian in your heart and in our hearts. But we don't need you to be Indian in terms of citizenship and nationality. You need to become Kenyan and Ugandan, and you need to contribute to the building of those societies. I thought that was such a mature attitude that Nehru had towards the people who had decided to go out and live elsewhere. Because he was, I think, sympathetic to this idea of dual loyalties, and he didn't want that to become a problem for Indian people living outside. And you see what happens a generation, less than a generation later, is that there's this conflict that Idi Amin, and in fact even in Kenya, both in Kenya and Uganda, Indians are expelled, and in Tanzania, Indians are expelled, and they go in large numbers to the UK and to the US and so on. They're expelled from these countries because the government say, well, you are leeching our society, you're not contributing to national development. I think that position that Nehru takes is a sociological position. It's a position about which comes very deeply informed, I think, by an understanding of migration. So I think that over time, different relations will be constituted, but for now there are immense gaps. People are not, they don't socialize together with each other as much as you would imagine or expect. And it's not just the fault of the Indians. This is a problem of the United States, of highly segregated society. It's a problem of relatively young immigrants, who are still trying to preserve a certain idea of their culture and language and so on. And these things combine to produce separations and divisions, which is what makes, say, the experience of Kamala Harris so unique. There's not a large community, for instance, of people who are children of, say, African American or Caribbean and Indian parents. There's not a large community. That makes her situation unique, relatively unique. And that's what makes Donald Trump's statements so offensive, in a way that it doesn't understand, what I think of as the deeply courageous act of Kamala Harris's parents. I mean, imagine what it must have been like for her mother to confront whatever her parents felt, or even Donald Harris's family. These kind of relationships create their own problems, and these courageous people tried to go beyond it. Okay, their marriage only lasted about a decade, but she emerged from there. That's her history. You can't take that away from her.
Right. Going beyond the Indian part of the equation, this is probably the second quote unquote black candidate after Obama and Kamala Harris. They have similarities, especially in their parents. One was raised by a white mother, the other is raised by an Indian mother. There's this charge that they are not black enough, which is actually what Donald Trump did. This was a charge against Obama too, that someone who hasn't had a legacy or the history or the African American life, the typical African American life in the US, from their ranks, they have not come. So they're not black enough. And it's come from both within the black community and outside also. Although criticism from the outside would seem very politically expedient, but this is there. So, in that sense, where do you think the blacks have come as far as making a mark in American politics at the highest levels?
Yeah, it's a very, this is a very both interesting and difficult thing to talk about, because on the one side, this is emblematic of the deep history of US racism against people who had been enslaved, and then people who had been held in a kind of post enslavement Jim Crow apartheid. In that period, extraordinary strides were made by black politicians, including Martin Luther King Jr., who is one of America's greatest politicians. He emerged from the deep roots of Southern slavery, and he became one of the most bright and shining stars in the United States. I mean, imagine if he had not been assassinated. Where might Martin Luther King Jr. have gone? Would he have become the first black president of the United States? Extraordinary, charismatic, and bright man. What kind of history could he have written had he not been assassinated? There are so many important and leading figures who emerge out of the black community who have been killed, whose political histories have been shut down in one way or the other, sitting as political prisoners and so on. People who, frustrated by liberalism, went into things like the Black Panthers or Malcolm X. Extremely creative and brilliant people, but not permitted to have a political career in the mainstream. So, this is an indictment of the United States. I mean, saying that Obama's father is Kenyan or that Kamala Harris's father is Jamaican, is an indictment of the United States and its experience. That why hasn't the United States experience been able to have a child of the history of enslavement rise to that level? Well, because bright people who come out of that history over the last 100 years have been shot down, not just shot, like king, but set aside, not allowed to enter, liberal politics, pushed into the margins and so on. I mean, I can list, hundreds of names of people who haven't been able to, come into, let's call it liberal politics, and rise, with rapidity, which their talents would have allowed them to rise, just not permitted. That's an indictment. I don't think this is saying anything about Kamala Harris or Barack Obama. This is saying a lot about the US political system. Now, that doesn't mean that there haven't been some very bright and important black politicians who have gone into the US Congress, who have gone into the Senate, and so on. Not that many in the Senate, but a large number into the US Congress, into the state houses. People have struggled and fought, and lifted themselves into those roles, been emissaries of the black community in those political spaces. Thurgood Marshall, extraordinary lawyer, went up to the Supreme Court, broke that barrier. He doesn't come from a history that is from outside the U.S. territory. So there are plenty of examples, but it is interesting, and I think, again, I've already described it in a negative way. It is interesting that their parents are both from outside the United States. The parents who are of African descent, one from Kenya, one from Jamaica. There's something here that's important, Kalyan, to recognize. I mean, within India, for instance, my first book, for instance, was on a Dalit community in northern India, the Balmiki community. Within India, you can read a person's confidence. There are, of course, individual skills and individual histories and so on, but caste is a determinant of an individual's confidence level. Those who are raised in dominant caste households, or in households with a certain cultural badge of acceptance, those children become much more confident than children who are raised in an oppressed caste community, where you are constantly belittled and harassed and so on. Well, similarly, neither Obama's father nor Donald Harris were raised in a society where they were belittled. In Jamaica, the black population is the dominant population. Donald Harris comes from a upper middle class family. He was raised with an extraordinary amount of confidence as a person. He wasn't raised in Oakland and belittled and harassed by the police every day and so on. Obama's father as well was raised in Kenya. Was raised in a prosperous environment. Didn't have the slurs of racism slung at him. He grew up in a majority black society. So when they raise children, even if they didn't play an active role in their lives, the framing reference for them isn't beware of the police. I mean, it's a classic trope in black American families who have come out of that long history of oppression, where they tell the children, be careful of the police. And my God, they are not saying something hallucinatory. The number of black children killed by police officers is not a joke. Hundreds of people a year. So parents tell their children, be careful of the police. You're a proud black man, you're a proud black woman, things like that, reinforcing confidence. Well, neither Kamala Harris nor Obama needed that. They had it instinctively. And I think that's, again, an indictment of US racism, more than it is a question of whether Kamala Harris is black enough. I mean, is Trump intelligent enough? I mean, I don't know what these questions are. There's a ridiculousness to them. I mean, she is who she is, man. She's running for the president. Donald, you are who you are. You're running for the president. It's not a question of black enough. I mean, he's trying to peel away sections of the African American community, particularly in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. Whether he'll succeed is different, but his tone is offensive when he, as a white man, is trying to judge who is black enough. I mean, for God's sake, this sounds like a slave master trying to judge the value of their property. I mean, this is not language that one should tolerate in 2024.
Thank you, Vijay, for coming here and sharing those wonderful insights. Very insightful, enlightening too. It was a pleasure having you with us once again after many years. Thank you, Vijay. Thank you.
No, please, my pleasure, Kalyan. Anytime, I would love to be back to chat. It's so great to have this association, even briefly, back again with the Hindu.
Thank you, Vijay. Excellent. Thank you.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.